Okay, great. So welcome to this webinar hosted by the Society of Scholar Priests. My name is Peter Kong. I'm the rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Santa Maria, California. I'm also a board member of the Society of Scholar Priests and our webinars coordinator. And the topic for today's discussion is publishing, specifically how to publish an article. And I'm pleased to say that we're joined by the co-editors-in-chief of the Anglican Theological Review, which comes in an array of wonderful colors. So joining us today are the Reverend Dr. Jason Fout, who is Associate Professor of Anglican Theology at Bexley-Seabury Seminary, and he's one of the co-editors of the ATR. Say hi, Jason.
Hello.
And then also Dr. Scott MacDougall, who is Assistant Professor of Theology at Church Divinity School of the Pacific and is the other co-editor of the ATR. So
good to be here, thanks.
Yeah. And then I hope he'll be joining us later, the Reverend Dr. Dan McClain, who is another one of our board members of the Society of Scholar Priests. He's Associate Rector at Bruton Parish and Chaplain to the College of William and Mary. He's also one of the Associate Editors of the ATR. So the plan for the webinar is we'll have a conversation and open up for questions afterwards. If you have a question, you can type it into the chat box on Zoom and we'll make sure it gets answered, or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. So just jumping right in, so beginning with just an intro to the ATR and sort of an overview. So I know the ATR has been around for quite a while. I think it just celebrated its 100-year anniversary, but there's been some recent changes in the editorial staff and also the location. So I was wondering if you could briefly just tell us some about the ATR, its mission and focus of the journal, and sort of the vision for the future.
Sure, absolutely. Let me just take a quick step back and say, yes, we did celebrate our 100th anniversary just with the last volume. We had a special centenary edition where we combed back through all of the decades that we've published and pulled out a number of really high quality essays. And I did this with Roger Furlow, and it was a real treat, I think, to be able to become familiar with the history of the journal. It was also, it meant we had some hard decisions to make. Part of the hard decisions were actually that we didn't want to republish something that had already been printed, sort of reprinted in a collection or something. And so that meant there were pieces by Wolfhard Pannenberg and Sarah Coakley and Paul Ricoeur and others, big names, the sorts of names that, most everyone would know, that had been reprinted. And so we couldn't print those, but instead we did find a wide variety of, I'm really pleased that Dan can join us. We found a really great variety of good pieces that represented, we thought, the breadth of the journal through the century, and it included names like Kelly Brown Douglas, Vida Dutton Scudder, David F. Ford, John Webster, and quite a few others as well. So it was a real treat to see the sorts of work that we had featured and encouraged over that century. And we see our mission as contributing to encouraging, resourcing the theological conversation in Anglicanism and especially North American Anglicanism. We're the journal for Anglican theological education, Episcopal theological education in North America. And so I'm just really pleased that we're able to fulfill that vocation in a number of ways. So that's been just a really rough sense, I think, of the century. We've had a number of editors-in-chief through that time. Most recently of note would be Charles Heffling, now emeritus from Boston College, who for some time was editor-in-chief, and then more recently Ellen Wandre, now professor of theology emerita from Bexley-Seabury. The two of them made huge contributions to the journal, dedicated in terms of their time and energy, and really in many ways brought the journal to its present shape. And it's in their footsteps that Scott and I hope very much to be following. We're really pleased that they invited both of us to be editors-in-chief. Talking with Ellen in particular, it's quite clear that this is a demanding job, and actually not only the workload, I mean the workload's fine, but especially having the opportunity to discuss decisions with another person, to have a meeting of the minds, as it were, at an editorial meeting where we can together make decisions about the future direction of the journal and decisions that we're making has been just a godsend. And of course, Scott's a great colleague to work with, which of course makes that all the better. So our vision really for the journal, though, is to continue encouraging, extending, and resourcing those theological conversations. And we do that through featuring essays from established and emerging scholars, and we think that balance is really important. We don't want it just to be all the usual suspects. On the other hand, we are also really pleased that a number of senior and established scholars are keen to be published with us. And in the next year or so, you'll see a number of sort of names being featured in our pages, and we're really pleased and proud of that. And so we want both to encourage emerging and newer scholars and also feature accessible scholarship by senior and established scholars. We print material, we print essays that we think will be of interest to our readers. And that's actually the major criterion for us, I think. It doesn't need to be about Anglicanism writ small, as it were. It's not a really focused sort of antiquarian interest like that. It's not just, we don't do pure history, we do some historical theology. But it needs generally to be of interest to our readers, and we take our readers to be particularly at that intersection of academy and church. And so we're really keen. I mean, in some ways, we dovetail very closely, I think, with what I take the mission of the scholar priests to be, and that is, to be really working at that coalface between church and academy. On the one hand, encouraging top drawer scholarship, and on the other hand, insisting on clarity and application, and accessibility to a wider readership than just a narrow, discipline-specific kind of a journal. That's really what we're looking for. And so in that sense, we're really keen, especially to serve the North American church, and we're very careful to include particularly Canadian representatives along with that. We're not just all Americans. But then alongside that, too, we're also really interested in being a part of the global conversation within the Anglican Communion. And we feature scholars from around the world. We have a piece coming out by Bruce Kay from Australia before long. We've featured a number of scholars from Africa within the last volume. And we really encourage these contributions simply because I think that it's important for the conversation. It enriches the journal, and it enriches the larger conversation within the communion.
Great. So you mentioned the mission is sort of furthering theological conversation. Sounds like we got some feedback there. At this sort of intersection of the academy and the church. So who would you say your target audience is then? Who's reading the ATR?
It's a combination of graduate students, established scholars, and also working clergy. We're especially interested, I think, to continue to encourage working clergy and sort of educated lay people to use the journal, to subscribe to the journal, to see it as a resource for themselves, to give us feedback on how we can continue working to serve this population better. And so really that's kind of the intersection that we see ourselves at.
I think the educated lay reader, I want to underscore that component, because the idea that the ATR is primarily pitched, at least as we're articulating it, and not just Jason and I, but the whole editorial board, really focusing on the general reader in many ways, the general reader with some acquaintance and desire to deepen an already existing body of knowledge and interest in the theological aspect of Anglicanism, and then indeed of Christianity more largely. And that the scholarly work that we bring to bear on that is certainly of interest to specialists, and certainly of interest, for example, to me as an instructor in a classroom, to be able to bring that material to use in the educational setting, but also just of interest it's accessible to people who are interested in the resources that Anglican theology has for deepening religious and spiritual engagement in their life of faith and in their life of discipleship. So that remains a signal, I believe, a signal contribution to the complexion of worldwide Anglicanism, and that we're simultaneously devoted to doing high-level scholarship and to making that scholarship available and openly graspable by those in both the academy and the general public. It's without it being a sort of hitting a lowest common denominator, right? It still retains high standards of scholarly excellence. We still want people to be able to cite this material in published work, and to teach it, and to collect it in edited volumes subsequently, for example. But we also want people to be able to pick it up and say, this matters. And so that is the general readership of the ATR, as we ask our authors to imagine the general reader. So they're not pitching it to their tenure committee, but neither are they pitching it to the parish newsletter. They're pitching it to someone with some love for theology and some general acquaintance with the discipline, but not expertise necessarily. And I think that's the sort of, I hate this phrase so much, sweet spot we're trying to hit, but that is where we're trying to land, I think.
And I think it can be seen in that, on the one hand, our essays are peer-reviewed. And so, we're working to ensure that we have the highest sort of reviewable standards of scholarship. And on the other hand, too, we have, as one of our editorial expectations, that essays will not be sort of overtaken by the footnote apparatus. Sometimes you'll be reading an essay in other journals, and a half of the page will be footnotes, and sort of scoring points or weighing in on this extraneous debate over here. And we absolutely discourage it, because we don't think that is useful or friendly to readers. We want people to be able to support what they're saying with why citation, footnote, but not to carry on debates and disputes in the footnotes. That just ends up being distracting. So, the one hand, working toward the highest standards, on the other hand, also, keenly interested in keeping it accessible, readable, and pitched to a wide audience, which is interested in theology.
Oh, that's great. It definitely lines up with sort of the mission of the Society of Scholar Priests, where we're trying to build connections between scholarship and then also parish ministry. So what you're talking about with the ATR sort of aligns really well with what we're all about. And you've touched on some of this already, but where do you see the place of the ATR in relation or service to the church? I mean, the Episcopal Church, Anglican Communion, and the broader body of Christ, and sort of dovetailing with that, what kind of materials are you looking to publish, or what best serves your readership?
It's a very good question, Peter. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about the question, just so that it's clear what's
Sure,
on the
sure.
table.
Yeah. So the first one, I'm thinking about sort of how you envision the role and place of the ATR in relation to the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church. So kind of how do you see it? Sort of, you talked about furthering theological conversation. I think on the website it talks about being sort of the unofficial journal of Episcopal seminaries. And so how do you sort of envision or see your place as a journal in relation to the church? And then the follow-up question is, what kind of materials would you does the journal seek to publish? And we can sort of separate those questions so that's easier.
I think there's a couple of ways I see a couple of different vectors in terms of the contribution that you're asking about. So let's take one. One would be theological education. So one of the ways that we think the Anglican Theological Review can make a contribution to the larger work of the communion is in contributing to theological education. So the articles that are published, there is a strand of the articles that we publish that we can easily see being used in the educational setting for particular live debates in the formation of clergy or the formation of lay leaders in the Anglican Communion. I am very interested for myself in developing and Jason and I have been working on this, developing a set of emerging essays called brief introductions to various facets of theology from an Anglican perspective. So you'll see that in the next issue, for example, there will be an inaugural article in that series by Kelly Brown Douglas on theological method. And the reason for this was because I was looking in my own teaching, an article that was a good article length précis on how Anglicans do the work of theology, not a book length treatment and not a brief, an in-depth dive into a particular theologian, for example, but something that was really focused on thinking through the method question in Anglican theologizing. And that is envisioned for use in an educational context. It won't be solely of interest within one, but that would be a primary audience for it. And so we have one of our many eyes is directed toward theological education. Another would be toward emerging debates in the churches regarding particularly prescient theological issues. So if there are articles about matters that are exercising the theological imaginations of particular local churches in the ecumenical sense, whether that's sort of the provincial church in North America or possibly the worldwide Anglican Communion, on particular issues, say immigration, say having to do with climate, all sorts of, or democracy, what kinds of resources can be brought to bear on the questions that are exercising Anglicans at the moment. Perhaps also there are pieces of pending legislation in various synodical bodies around the Anglican Communion, around, say, prayer book revision or around changing conceptions of the episcopate. Maybe some of our contributors would like to weigh in on some of those, to contribute to those ongoing conversations in the hope that those who read the journal will find that there's some use in reading those articles as they carry on these debates in the various bodies of which they are members. So there's a and Jason, I'm sure could come up with can articulate even more, but those are the two that first come to my mind: are theological education and the actual governance structures of Anglican bodies as we can contribute to the work that they're doing and the discernment they're doing as synods.
Yeah, I think I would add to that and say that we, being a quarterly and a journal, we tend to be less newsy, less sort of animated by the issue of the day. We do, as Scott suggested, weigh in on this or that. And I say we, of course, I mean the contributors. But it's more a matter of a kind of middle ground perspective, I might say. Instead of within this 24-hour news cycle, how can we respond to this issue? It's rather a matter of trying to develop a considered response of one kind or another to this or that issue, whether of broadly cultural, socio-political issues, or more specifically church issues. And so we really try to resist the instant response and instead create some space where some considered thinking on the issue can emerge, and we don't determine in advance just how that thinking will emerge, what perspective might come in. We have a wide variety of contributors, and our bias is always toward good theology, clear writing, good thinking, and not a particular political perspective or other, since we see ourselves as representing the breadth of Anglicanism in North America in particular. We actually do see that there is some breadth there. And, again, so long as it is a good piece of writing with some considered theologizing in it, we're always very open to that. And I think over the past couple of volumes, we've seen that in one issue or another. Issues about prayer book revision, for example, or in our water issue, a number of converging but slightly different perspectives on issues around water and water justice, water ethics, and so forth.
Great. Well, I think now we'll dive more into the particulars of the publishing process. So just to begin, the ATR publishes a variety of different kinds of content under headings like articles, reviews in depth, book reviews, practicing theology. You also publish poetry and review articles. And so could you say just briefly sort of what differentiates those different categories of content? Like I know the difference between a poetry and an article, but maybe the practicing theology section, or kind of what's counts as like a review in depth or something like that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the research articles, which is easiest, right? So a research article is usually a substantive piece of around 7,500 words, including the notes, and it's engaging some facet of Anglican theology, as Jason said, theologizing that is of interest to the Anglican world, whether that's particularly an Anglican theologian or just of a theological theme of interest to our way of doing that work. And that's just the most straightforward, clear research article, making some kind of a constructive move. It's going to not be 100% historical. If there's going to be, if it's investigating the theological perspective of a particular historical figure, it needs to make some constructive move as an implication and concluding gesture at the end of it, so that it's not just a historical review or assessment. It is also, we don't do straight up biblical scholarship in terms of, there are specialist journals that do that. So if one is doing a deep dive into the theology of Ecclesiastes, say, that is completely fine, as long as the focus there is on the theology of that particular text and not a historical critical reconstruction of the origins of Ecclesiastes, and so forth and so on, so that it remains theological in its focus as opposed to a historical textual investigation, or even just an exegesis without a theological, a pronounced theological cast to the exegetical endeavor. So, but otherwise, it's generally quite open, so that it would run the gamut from ethics to different doctrines within theological move. And that, again, 7,500 words about with including the footnotes, which should simply be bibliographic rather than substantive in nature. The other the other kinds of articles, practicing theology, tends to be around 3,500 words and tends to be a little bit briefer. So in its briefness, it's more narrowly focused on how theology gets instantiated generally in the life of ministry. So in what way does theology come to play a role in the work that clergy do in carrying out the service that clergy are formed and ordained to provide? So I do not like, for deep theological reasons, I do not like a distinction between theory and practice, or theory and application. But if we were going to make that crude distinction, the practicing theology section, as indicated by its very nature about practice, would come down on the application side more heavily than it would on the straight up theological or theoretical side. So it's a matter of emphasis rather than it is a straight bifurcation between theory and practice. There should be practice in research articles, and there should be theory in practicing theology articles. Now, in terms of the reviews in depth, that's where I'll turn to Jason to sort of pull apart the reviews in depth, research essays, and that kind of thing, because we have another editor who actually queues those up and works with authors on creating them, whether that be around particular themes or just because someone has approached and said, I'd like to do one or the other on a particular theme. So we both curate those and are approached to do them. And Jason can tell you more about how that works.
That's exactly right. It's so we can talk about review articles, we can talk about reviews in depth, and we can talk about book reviews generally. Review articles or review essays are essay length, so say between 5,000 and 8,000 words, broadly speaking, might be a little shorter article potentially. But as Scott's already indicated, it can take either a theme or a particular author or thinker, or a number of different perspectives even, but having some coherence over 3, 4, 5, 7 different pieces and reviewing each of them within an article. So the idea behind this is, on the one hand, to air reviews of some significant works, recent works often. And so, for example, an issue or two ago, we had a review essay on works in disability theology. And on the one hand, the value of this was to show what was being done in disability theology today. So one, recent works in disability theology, but also two, to provide an introduction to disability theology as a discipline, to give some broad brushstroke history of the discipline, and so that someone who would be new to it, who is unfamiliar with it, who might be wanting to come up to speed on it, could do so by means of reading this essay. But then also, thirdly, that essay in particular offered some questions and critiques about some of the themes in disability theology, and looked at some tensions within the discipline and mused a bit on future directions in it. It was a very rich piece. Likewise, there was, in the issue before that, a review of Oliver O'Donovan's 3 recent works in theological ethics. And again, this gave the author some space to go into some depth on this major 3-volume set by an established scholar, and to talk about what O'Donovan is doing, why it matters, what are the major features and outlines of his work there, and a little bit how it fits in with his larger body of work. A few issues before that, we had a really great review essay, and here it wasn't looking just at one particular theme or one particular work by an author, but it was rather a retrospective for all of Marilyn Adams's work, and it really surveyed her life contributions in some ways. It was an amazingly rich piece, but again, it was really valuable then for readers who didn't know her work to be able to come up to speed in just through reading one essay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's review articles, and those are through Jacob Sherman, who works particularly in this area. And again, he will solicit authors for, tendencies that he's seeing in publishing, or this theme, or that figure. But he's also very interested, I think probably particularly interested, in hearing proposals from potential authors. Reviews in depth tend to be a bit longer than our standard review, and they might look at one book in some depth, and by some depth here I'm meaning, say, 1,200 to 1,600 words, or they might possibly look at two works in about that many words. But much more than that, and you start to get into a review article. A review in depth could, again, look at two works by the same author, two related works or unrelated works, but on a similar theme. There are a number of different ways that you can put together a review in depth in very fruitful ways. To be able to compare and contrast two recent pieces on the same theme is a really valuable sort of effort. And then finally, book reviews are fairly standard. Our book reviews tend to be a bit shorter than other journals. I've written for other journals, and sometimes their book reviews can be 1,000 to 1,200 words, as many as 1,500 words. Our reviews clock in at 600 to 800 words, and that's fairly strict. But we think that gives enough space to give some good sense of what the book is about, raise some questions, show a few connections with other disciplines or other people working in the same discipline, and then just kind of get out of the way and move on. It's a popular section. We have different book reviewers, different book review editors working in different sections. And so, for example, our colleague Dan McClain here is the book review editor for Theology and Ethics. And so he might approach one of you someday to review a book in Theology and Ethics, but also I encourage you, if you're interested in reviewing something in theology or ethics, please do approach him and ask. When I was book review editor, I was always very pleased to get proposals for a book that you would be interested in reviewing. We're not able to pay for it. Apparently some journals do. I've never encountered them myself, but you do get a free review copy of the book and an opportunity to appear in print in the journal. And then we also have book review editors in areas like biblical studies, pastoral theology, liturgical studies, poetry, ecclesiology and ecumenism, interreligious studies, and so forth. Theology and culture. And very soon we're having a new section which will be theology, arts, and literature, which will be looking both at theological considerations of art and literature, but it will also be looking at reviewing works of art or pieces of literature that are themselves theologically rich, or might be given a rich theological reading, even if they're not intentionally so. And that's Jake Andrews, who's coming on board for that. So that gives you a sense, I think, of the three different sorts of review writing that we do. Dan, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, that was pretty comprehensive. I know I've gotten questions in the past about what a well-structured book review might look like, and I've had a number of really fruitful conversations with folks about the different forms that can take, the kinds of books that we're interested in soliciting reviews for, and it's difficult to summarize all of that in ways that's going to leave us flexible enough to, I think, show the kind of rich panoply of books that are out there, but would be very happy to take those sorts of questions. And you can find all of our contact information on the ATR website. And in fact, the link that you would want to look for is called, is it right? Yes, right. And then you can go to info for authors and book review guidelines and find all that salient information there.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. That's really helpful. And so, it sounds like you solicit authors for certain articles and book reviews, and then also you have a sort of unsolicited submissions or proposals coming forward. So for some of these things, like a review article, it sounds like the best thing to do would be to contact the editor, so either Jacob or whoever is the over that topical section of book reviews, and say, I'm willing to do a book review, or I'd like to do a book review about some specific work, would be the best way to do it, and not just write it and send it unsolicited.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
But in terms of writing a research article, though, would that be the kind of thing that you write it ahead of time and send it off? So say I'm a brand new young scholar or scholar priest, haven't tried to publish anything, and so where do I begin? How do I start that process?
So generally when we get an article of that kind, it's because the author has already got it on hand and they're trying to publish something they've written. And they think the ATR is going to be a good outlet and a match for the particular piece of writing they've already done. When you're trying to write specifically for the ATR, which you could certainly do, and you have not yet written something, I think it's perfectly reasonable to write to the co-editors-in-chief, either Jason or myself or both of us, and say, I'm really considering writing an article on the following theme, and here's the tack I would take. Would this be of interest to the journal? And that's completely fine. We would make no promises, obviously, but we would say, just as I make no promises to students based on their thesis statements. But if you would say, we could say an article of that kind would certainly be of interest to us, or that an article of that kind would be of interest to us. However, be careful you don't make it a completely historical piece, or be careful that you do not get so bogged down in the Aramaic of this that you don't actually tell us why it should matter. All of those kinds of things. So we would provide some guidance at the initial stage like that. We don't look at drafts. We just don't have the time for that. But we would certainly be willing to hear somebody pitch an idea and provide some feedback on an initial idea for an unwritten piece, or to say, I have an article on the following topic. Would you be interested in seeing it? That's fine. Or you can just look at our website, again, at the section of our website that Dan has already pointed people toward. There is guidelines. There are guidelines there for authors of research articles. And if you feel like you are ready to go, then you can format that thing the way we like to see it and send it right into ATR submissions at I don't want to misspeak. The website, the proper submission link, email address is there. So you can go right ahead and format that off and send it with a CV and bio, and we'll take a look at it.
And we try to get back to people within 6 to 8 weeks with some sense, sooner if we can. But if you've submitted an essay to us, we try to respond. We try to get it through either respond one way or the other, or have the review process finished by about 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, and that sort of touches on the next question I was going to ask is, say I've got a draft of an article and I've looked at your submission guidelines and sent it off. So what happens next after I send it off?
Well, you'll receive a response from us that would say thank you for your submission, first of all, and we would acknowledge receipt of the manuscript, and then either an author would either receive a letter stating that we can't publish it because it doesn't fit our guidelines, or because it's too long, or a variety of other reasons that we might give. We try to give some substantive feedback rather than just saying thank you for your efforts, but no thank you. We try really hard to do that. Or you may hear nothing from us because the piece has gone into peer review. And then you would hear back from us after peer review to say, again, thank you, but we can't publish the article for the following reasons. Or thank you, and we are disposed to publish, but before we do that, we would need serious revisions or minor revisions along the following lines. Or we can't publish this as it stands at all, and we would need you to, but we are interested in your topic. And if you're willing to sort of take this thing down to the studs and rework it, rebuild it, we would be interested in hearing from you again, given the following considerations. But, and then providing some feedback from our internal review and the peer review process. So we try really hard to provide useful feedback, whether we accept the article or not. Sometimes we simply, there is no feedback to provide. It just is really outside of our guidelines, or it's or there's some other reason why there's really not much we can say. And so, but for the most part, we try really hard to give a rationale without leaving the door open for argument. Because if we can't publish it, we cannot publish it. And there's no sense in someone pushing back and saying, but. That's not a good use of anyone's time. So we try really hard not to leave the door open for that. But otherwise, we try really hard to provide an author with some constructive feedback that they can use both to know our journal better, but also so that they can improve as scholars and as writers. Because we do hope that our peer does provide some insight into the process of writing for them that might help fine-tune their skills.
And I'll just say, in the last 3 to 4 months, I recall seeing a number of manuscripts that were really quite fine, but they just weren't for us. One would have been a great contribution to a journal of missiology. Another one was for Anglican and Episcopal history. And I think a third one would have been a really great candidate for the Journal of Anglican Studies. And so, if it seems fitting to us, if otherwise it's a fine piece, and there's just a bit of a category error perhaps with, where it's been submitted, we might also provide some guidance, not necessarily connection. I mean, whether someone wants to take that up or not, that's their business. But, in offering a rejection on the basis of this isn't really what ATR does, we might also try to suggest, but you might consider this other journal instead. And I'll also just say, just technically speaking, Scott, I think there was one option that you didn't mention that we do occasionally use, and that is after it's gone through peer review, we'll write back and say, thank you for submitting this, and this is great, we want to publish it. So, but anyway.
Yeah, there is that.
Yeah.
There is that. In terms of the wider issue around publication, outside of just the ATR universe, and as Jason was speaking a moment ago, it reminded me that this is useful information for would-be authors of any kind, is that when you're making an approach to any kind of a publisher, whether it's for a book manuscript or for an article in a journal, the thing that's really, really crucial, also is important for grant makers. So if you're approaching a philanthropy for a grant, the thing that's really, really, really super crucial is that you've done your homework on the publisher or grantor, that you've really read their guidelines, that you really know what they're all about, and that you are submitting something that is really within the wheelhouse that they have articulated. If we got we've also had it be the case, for example, that people have been angry with the ATR for not publishing their article on translation of a particular biblical script text. And the response received back was, I'm shocked to learn the ATR is not interested in the Bible. Well, it's not that we're not interested in the Bible, but we have a primary commitment to theology. So and there are biblical studies journals that do that work, and it would be much more suited to those publications. And so it's really important for would-be writers to be very familiar with the profiles of the various publishers and, again, grantors that are, I'd say this is someone who had a 10-year career in philanthropy, right? So I reviewed a lot of grant proposals. And I know that a lot of working clergy are looking for financial support for projects and so on. So the thing that's really crucial is that you are answering to guidelines without it looking like a shoehorn fit. That there's some ease of fit between what you're doing without you being distorting yourself out of recognition to yourself, and that you're not asking the grantor to go beyond what, or the publisher to go beyond what is their remit and their mission. And everyone will be happier as a result, and you'll be likely to get less rejections as a result. So that's very important, is really knowing who you are approaching and with what.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We've got a little bit of time left, and I did want to, we've spoken some about the book review process. And so maybe Dan can chime in here. So let's say, I'm interested in doing a book review as a way to kind of ease into the publishing world, but how do I go about doing that? So I contact you and identify myself as someone that's willing and available to do book reviews, or do I come to you with a specific book in mind, or can you help sort of demystify that book review process a little?
Yeah, absolutely. There's really two ways to go about it, and you've identified them both. The first would be that you would approach me or one of the other book review editors and just identify yourself as a person with such and such qualifications. So, maybe hi, I'm a PhD student in theology, or I wrote an advanced master's thesis in church history, or I'm really interested in Anglican and Roman Catholic ecumenism. Any number of those sorts of interest areas or competencies. And I'd be happy to write reviews for you if you have something. Here's my CV, and here's the best way to reach me. The second way would be, again, introducing yourself with your competencies, qualifications, and say, I'd be really interested in reviewing this book that was published in the last 2 years, last 2 years. And at that point, if you approached, say, me with the first, I would look at the books that we've already got at the ATR World Headquarters in Sewanee, Tennessee, and try and identify a good fit. Maybe it's a book that's been sort of burning a place on the shelf and it really needs to get reviewed, and here's the right person to do it. Or I might say, we don't have anything right now, but if you've got something in mind, please let me know, and I'll certainly be in touch with you once we have something. In the second option, that the person approached me with a book, I would look at our database and see if one of our reviewers was already tackling that work, and if the work was available, I would very likely write back to you and say, we'd love to have you review that book. And we would have our administrative staff send the free review copy that Jason mentioned earlier to you. And at that point, we'd begin talking about a date that I'd like to see the review complete by.
And I'll just add two quick things to that. First of all, I think we're interested. One person who might be interested in reviewing would be someone working on a PhD. And that's maybe especially helpful because you can often get a quality new copy of a recent piece of scholarship that might be intrinsic to your research that frankly might be $130 or £110 or what have you otherwise. So you get a copy of something you would have to be reading anyway. You get an opportunity to review it and become familiar with it on a different level than you might otherwise, and you're able to build your publishing record a bit and get a hand in with some experience. And so, and also be able to weigh in on an area in which you're an emerging expert. So that said, and at the same time, I'd also say that a good book reviewer is someone who can do the work. And by that I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a theological degree or not. It doesn't matter if you have a PhD or not. It doesn't matter whether you have an MDiv or not. It matters that you can do the work. I've had a few people with PhDs in theology who didn't seem to be able to write book reviews for one reason or another. But I've also known people, parish priests, without a PhD, without an advanced degree beyond the MDiv, write really great reviews. I've had lay people with some background in theology write really great reviews too. And so if you're considering doing this, the main criterion, as far as I'm concerned at least, is the quality of the work, and not necessarily a CV or a background. The CV helps us to know you and your areas of competency and interest and what you've done beforehand. But every bit as important as that, I'd say, is the work you've done in the past and the work you're able to do now.
Great. That's really helpful, and I think helpful also to sort of, like I said, sort of demystify the process. And one of the things I'm hearing is the importance of just kind of communication, that, you're approachable people. We can reach out to you and say, I'm thinking about writing about this. Would that be of interest? Or identifying yourself as someone who could be a potential reviewer. So with what time we have left, about 10 minutes, I wanted to open it up to questions from other people who are participating in the webinar. So that's, I don't know if you have any comments or questions that you have for our editors here.
This is a question to either of the editors. This is Walt Knowles. I've got an article. Am I not coming across?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Peter was holding his ear as if he couldn't hear me. I'm playing around with a couple of article ideas that are outside my general academic area. I'm a liturgist, and I'm sort of looking at practical theology. Is there a particular way you'd like to see that pitched when it comes to you, or just send it in and say, hey, I'm playing with this idea?
You mean in terms of an initial survey to ask if we're interested, or
yes,
or to actually?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I think the way what you'd want to say. I mean, I certainly think, and I think I can speak for Jason on this too. Neither of us are that hung up on someone's training and background.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you say, I have an idea on the following thing, is this an idea that you'd be interested in hearing about? The answer would be either yes or no based on the quality of the idea, not on the quality of the author.
Okay.
And then we make a determination on the work once the work has materialized. It wouldn't be, and then the thing that would be of interest, the thing that would be more determinative there would be people in that field would be the peer reviewers, and they would be able to say this person hasn't become deeply acquainted enough with the field. They haven't interacted with the right people. They don't have the operative language of the discipline. So that would all be something that would come out in peer. We wouldn't necessarily weigh in on that in advance.
Okay.
So the issue for us at the forward end would simply be to say, thank you for your idea. Your idea strikes us as, and we would let you know. And then you would then either submit a manuscript on the basis of that feedback, or it would have fallen outside of our interest. Jason, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. Just so.
Thanks, that's helpful.
All right. Any other questions or comments or things that you all wanted to address that we haven't covered yet?
no, I think you've done a really good job helping us survey what the ATR is and what it's all about. We try really hard to the extent that we can, to have especially the churches of the Anglican and Episcopal churches of North America think of this as their journal. So it's your journal too, those of you who are participating in this webinar. Even though we are stewarding it at the moment, it is the journal of the church, not of Jason and me. So we really hope that you will think of it that way, and that you will work with us in getting out your ideas to your church, and to the people who you are poised to serve, and to be in conversation with. We think of the ATR as a place where theological conversation is pursued rather than theological determinations. So I'm hoping that you'll feel empowered and warmly invited to participate in that to the extent that you feel called to do so.
Fantastic. Well, this has been really helpful, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And this recording will be available later on our website, which is scholarpriest.org, and on our YouTube page. And then also, if you want more information about the Anglican Theological Review, you can go to their website at it's anglicantheologicalreview.org, and there's contact information for the editors, and also more information and guidelines for authors. And I also encourage you to subscribe. So it's a good journal to read. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing this, Peter. And we hope to hear from folks in the SSP and see how we can work together.
Great. All righty. I'm going to